Call me Napoleon. Not Bonaparte, not the little corporal, and certainly not the Corsican upstart as my enemies would later name me. I am Napoleon, Emperor of France, and my story begins not in glory, but in the dust and heat of a small island called Corsica. I was born in 1769, just a year after France purchased Corsica. Some would later call this ironic, the great French emperor not even born French. But it shaped me in ways that would echo through history. I was an outsider who would rise to rule them all, a second son who would become first among men. My childhood was not one of privilege. Our family had noble blood but little money. I learned early the sting of poverty wearing through genteel pretensions. At school in France, the other boys mocked my Corsican accent, my poor clothes, my solitary nature. I retreated into books, military histories, mathematics, strategy. While they played at being soldiers, I studied how to become one. The revolution changed everything. I was 20 when it began, a young artillery officer with more ambition than opportunity. While others saw chaos, I saw possibility. The old order was crumbling, and in its ruins, a man could rise on merit rather than birth. This was my chance, and I seized it with both hands. My first real opportunity came at Toulon in 1793. The city had revolted against the revolution and invited in the British fleet. I was just a captain of artillery, but I saw what the generals couldn't, the key position that would make the British ships untenable. When I presented my plan, they laughed at my youth, my accent, my presumption. They stopped laughing when my strategy worked. The British fled, Toulon fell, and I was promoted to brigadier general at 24. But success breeds enemies. The fall of Robespierre nearly meant my own fall. I was briefly imprisoned, suspected of being a Jacobin. Those dark days taught me another lesson. Political survival was as important as military victory. When I emerged, I was more cautious, more calculating in my allegiances. Paris in 1795 was a tinderbox. The Directory was weak, the Royalists were plotting, the people were hungry. When Royalist forces marched on the convention, Paul Barras turned to me to defend the Republic. I did not hesitate. "Give me 5 minutes," I said, and positioned my artillery on the streets. The famous whiff of grape shot dispersed the Royalists and saved the revolution. More importantly, it marked me as a man who could be counted on in a crisis. My reward was command of the Army of Italy. They thought they were sending me to a backwater, giving the troublesome young general an impossible task with inadequate resources. I found an army in rags, unpaid and demoralized. "Soldiers," I told them, "you are poorly fed and almost naked. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." Those words would become legend, but at the time they were a gamble. My army was outnumbered, my supplies were limited, and the Austrians were confident. But I had studied every map, memorized every road and mountain pass. While they thought in terms of traditional warfare, I thought in terms of speed and surprise. The Italian campaign was where I forged my legend. Victory after victory, Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli. I outmaneuvered armies twice my size, struck where they least expected, turned their strengths into weaknesses. My soldiers began to believe I was invincible. Perhaps I began to believe it too. But it wasn't just military genius that marked these campaigns. I learned the power of propaganda, of image-making. My bulletins to Paris were masterpieces of self-promotion. Every victory was magnified, every setback minimized. I became more than a general. I became a symbol of French glory, of revolutionary success. I also learned the art of politics. In Italy, I negotiated treaties, reorganized governments, dealt with the Pope himself. I was no longer just a soldier, I was becoming a statesman. The Directory might rule in Paris, but in Italy I was creating my own power base. Josephine came into my life during this time. Our marriage was arranged by Barras. political on her part, passionate on mine. I was the rising general. She was the sophisticated widow with connections to the old and new regimes. When I left for Italy, I wrote her burning love letters. She took her time responding. Even then, perhaps we were more in love with the idea of each other than the reality. The conquest of Italy made me famous, but Egypt would make me legendary. The Directory wanted me far from Paris. My growing popularity made them nervous. They gave me an army and pointed me toward Egypt. It was meant to be an impossible mission, a glorious failure that would eliminate a potential rival. Egypt was where I learned to be more than a general. I brought scientists and scholars with my army, creating an institute to study this ancient civilization. While my soldiers fought, they discovered the Rosetta Stone, ancient temples, the foundations of modern Egyptology. I was creating a legacy beyond military victory. The military campaign itself was a mixture of triumph and disaster. The Battle of the Pyramids was a spectacular victory, my square formations destroying the Mameluke cavalry while 40 centuries looked down upon us, as I told my men. But then Nelson destroyed our fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding us in Egypt. Lesser men would have despaired. I turned disaster into opportunity. I became the Sultan el-Kabir, the Great Sultan, adopting Eastern customs, studying the Quran, presenting myself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. When Syria revolted, I marched across the desert to suppress it. The siege of Acre was a failure, but I turned even that into legend with my dramatic visit to the plague-stricken soldiers. But while I was playing Pharaoh in Egypt, France was losing its grip on Italy. The Directory was proving incompetent, corrupt, and weak. News reached me of political chaos in Paris. It was time to make a choice: stay in Egypt and likely fail, or abandon my army and return to France where opportunity beckoned. I chose France. Some called it desertion. I called it destiny. Slipping past British ships, I returned to a hero's welcome. The people were tired of corruption, tired of inefficiency, tired of chaos. They wanted order, glory, and success. I would give them all three. The end of this chapter found me positioned perfectly for power. I was the general who won impossible victories, the leader who could impose order on chaos, the man of destiny who could restore French glory. The Directory was wobbling, the people were restless, and I was ready. What followed would change not just France but all of Europe. But that is the next chapter of my story, the rise from general to first consul, from military leader to ruler of France. Would you like to hear how I seized power and began to reshape a continent? The coup of 18 Brumaire was not as smooth as history sometimes portrays it. When I returned from Egypt, France was ripe for change, but revolutions are delicate things. One wrong move and I would have ended up guillotined like so many others who had reached for power. CAS, that old revolutionary fox, thought he could use me as a sword to cut through the Directory's corruption. He saw me as a military tool for his political designs. "I need a sword," he said. What he didn't realize was that this sword had its own mind, its own ambitions. I would be no one's puppet. The actual coup was almost a disaster. In the Council of 500, they shouted, "Outlaw him, down with the dictator." My brother Lucien, presiding over the chamber, saved the day. When I froze, yes, even I had moments of doubt, he rallied the troops. "Would you believe that brigand wants to outlaw your general?" he cried to the soldiers. The moment passed, the council was dispersed, and by dawn I was first consul of France. I moved quickly to consolidate power. France needed order, needed efficiency, needed glory. I would give her all three. The Constitution of Year 8 made me first consul, but I was effectively the ruler of France. The other consuls were window dressing. I alone had the power to initiate legislation, control the army, and direct foreign policy. My first task was to create order from chaos. The Civil Code, later the Napoleonic Code, was my greatest civilian achievement. For the first time, France had a single, coherent legal system. Merit would replace privilege, law would replace arbitrary power. When my lawyers presented the first draft, I tore it apart, forcing them to make it clearer, more practical, more just. Education was reformed. I created the lycées, established the Grandes Écoles. My schools will form generations of soldiers, I said, but they formed more than that. They created administrators, engineers, scientists, the backbone of a modern state. Merit, not birth, would determine advancement. The economy was stabilized, the Bank of France was established, the currency reformed, taxes systematized. I understood that military power rests on economic foundations. France had been bankrupt. I made her solvent. The corrupt tax farmers were replaced by efficient state collectors. Roads were built, harbors dredged, trade encouraged. But peace was also necessary. With Austria, I negotiated the Treaty of Luneville. With Britain, the Peace of Amiens. France's borders extended to her natural frontiers, the Rhine, the Alps, the Pyrenees. For a brief moment in 1802, Europe was at peace, and I was its architect. These years as consul were perhaps my most productive. I worked 20 hours a day, dictating to multiple secretaries simultaneously, reading every report, mastering every detail. Impossible was a word I banned from my presence. When told something couldn't be done, I demanded to know why, then showed how it could be done. My style of rule was direct, personal, often abrupt. I would pepper experts with questions until I understood a subject completely. Ministers learned to come prepared with exact figures and precise details. I had no patience for vagueness or excuses. Be clear, be brief, be gone was my motto for meetings. The Concordat with the Catholic Church healed one of the Revolution's deepest wounds. France's majority could practice their faith again, but under state control. When I signed it, Voltaire's disciples were horrified. The Concordat, I told them, is the vaccine of religion. In 50 years, there will be no religion in France. I was wrong about that, but right about the need to reconcile church and state. The Legion of Honor was created during this time, a new nobility based on merit rather than birth. Some revolutionaries objected, calling it a return to aristocracy. Men are led by toys, I replied. The ribbon of the Legion became more prized than any ancient title. Josephine and I established ourselves at the Tuileries Palace. She created a court that combined republican simplicity with imperial grandeur. I allowed it because France needed both the old and the new, revolutionary merit wrapped in traditional glory. But there were already whispers about her inability to provide an heir. The plot against me in 1800, the infamous infernal machine assassination attempt, showed how fragile power could be. The Royalists blamed the Jacobins blamed the Royalists. I used the confusion to eliminate enemies on both sides. Harsh? Perhaps. But France needed stability more than she needed perfect justice. The Louisiana Purchase was one of my greater gambles. France couldn't defend this vast territory, and I needed money for European wars. Jefferson wanted New Orleans. I sold him a continent. This accession of territory, I said, strengthens forever the power of the United States, and I have given England a maritime rival that will sooner or later humble her pride. By 1804, it was clear that the consulate was insufficient. France had enemies abroad and conspirators at home. The Royalist plot to kidnap or kill me, supported by the British, convinced many that France needed a stronger government. The Senate offered me the title of Emperor. I accepted, not for myself, but for France, or so I told myself. The transformation from first consul to emperor wasn't just a change of title. It was the culmination of years of careful planning, of reshaping France's institutions, of creating a new kind of state, modern, efficient, meritocratic, but with the stability of monarchy. When Pope Pius VII came to Paris for my coronation, I staged a ceremony that combined ancient majesty with revolutionary legitimacy. The moment when I took the crown from his hands and placed it on my own head was carefully choreographed. I would not be crowned by anyone. My power came from myself, from France, from destiny. Looking back at the consulate years, I see now that they were my best chance to create lasting change. The reforms we implemented then in law, education, administration outlasted my empire. While my conquests were later reversed, the civil code remained. Was I already drunk with power? Perhaps, but I was also at my most effective, most focused on real reforms rather than military glory. France needed both the sword and the pen. During the consulate, they were in perfect balance. The next chapter would be one of empire, of ever-expanding frontiers, of battles that would become legend. But first, let me tell you of that day in Notre Dame, when a Corsican artillery officer became Emperor of the French. The Pope blessed me, but I crowned myself. That gesture contained everything you need to know about who I was and what I would become. As Emperor of the French, I was no longer merely a successful general or a political leader. I had become something more, a living legend, the embodiment of French glory, the heir to Charlemagne. But with that power came new challenges, new enemies, and ultimately new wars. The grand army I created was unlike anything Europe had seen before. While other armies fought in the old style, mine was organized into corps that could fight independently or combine swiftly. Each marshal commanded like a small army, but all worked together under my central direction. Speed, flexibility, concentration of force, these were my principles. Austerlitz, my greatest victory, exemplified this. December 2nd, 1805. The sun broke through the morning mist as Russian and Austrian forces fell into my trap. I had deliberately weakened my right flank, inviting them to attack while I prepared the counterblow. When they took the bait, I struck. "One sharp blow and the war is won," I told my marshals. By evening, the Allied army was shattered, and I was master of continental Europe. The Battle of Jena followed in 1806, destroying Prussian military power in a single day. Prussia, which had stayed neutral during earlier coalitions, finally joined the fight against me, too late. Their army, still using Frederick the Great's tactics, was obsolete. I destroyed them using maneuver warfare they couldn't comprehend. Berlin fell, and with it, the myth of Prussian invincibility. But it wasn't just military victories. I was reshaping Europe. The Confederation of the Rhine replaced the old Holy Roman Empire. My brothers and sisters became kings and queens, Joseph in Naples, then Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia. I created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, giving Poles hope for independence. The Code Napoleon spread across Europe, abolishing feudal privileges and establishing legal equality. My second marriage was part of this grand design. Josephine couldn't give me an heir, and France needed stability. Divorcing her was painful, we had shared so much, but dynasty demanded it. Marriage to Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, was meant to cement my place among Europe's royal families. When our son was born in 1811, I had him titled King of Rome. The future seemed secure. The continental system was my great gamble against Britain. Unable to defeat them at sea after Trafalgar, I tried to destroy their economy by closing European ports to their trade. It seemed logical. Britain was an island dependent on commerce. Cut off their markets and they would have to make peace. But the system had unintended consequences. Smuggling became rampant. Neutral nations resented being forced to choose sides. Russia, particularly, couldn't afford to stop trading with Britain. The seeds of my greatest mistake, the invasion of Russia, were sown in this economic warfare. Spain became my bleeding wound. What seemed simple, replacing an incompetent Bourbon with my brother Joseph, turned into a nightmare. The Spanish people rose in revolt. The British under Wellington found their opportunity. For the first time, I faced not just armies, but entire populations in resistance. The Russian campaign of 1812 was the turning point. I assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 500,000 men from all over my empire. Even now, I maintain the strategy was sound. Take Moscow, force Alexander to negotiate, secure my eastern frontier. But I hadn't counted on Russian resolve, on scorched earth tactics, on general winter. The burning of Moscow was my first real defeat. When the Russians set their own capital ablaze rather than let me have it, I should have recognized what it meant. But I waited too long, hoping for Alexander's surrender. By the time we retreated, winter had come. You know the story. The terrible cold, the Cossack raids, the starvation. Of that magnificent army, only a fraction returned. Yet even after Russia, I might have salvaged the situation, but my enemies had learned from me. They avoided decisive battles, retreated when I advanced, attacked when I withdrew. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, I faced all of Europe united against me. Even superior tactics couldn't overcome such numbers. The first abdication at Fontainebleau was bitter. Exile to Elba seemed like a bad joke, I who had ruled an empire reduced to a tiny island. But Elba had one advantage: it was close to France. I watched, I waited, I planned. When the opportunity came in 1815, I returned. The 100 Days were my last great gamble. Landing in France with a handful of men, I regained power without firing a shot. The eagle will fly from steeple to steeple until it reaches the towers of Notre Dame, I had promised. The armies sent to arrest me joined me instead. For a brief moment, the magic worked again, but Europe would not allow it. They declared me an outlaw, gathered their armies once more. Everything came down to Waterloo. One last battle, one last chance for victory. The delay in attacking, Ney's premature cavalry charges, the arrival of the Prussians under Blücher, small things that added up to disaster. This time there would be no escape to Elba. The British shipped me to Saint Helena, a rock in the middle of the Atlantic. There I would have time to reflect on glory and folly, on triumph and disaster, on what might have been and what was. But before we turn to those final years, let me ask you this. Was I wrong to reach so high? To try to unite Europe under French leadership? To spread the principles of the revolution, equality before the law, careers open to talent, modern administration, across the continent? History would judge me harshly, but history is written by the victors. I gave France glory, gave Europe a vision of unity, gave the world new codes of law and administration that would long outlive my empire. Yes, there was war, there was suffering, there was defeat, but there was also greatness. And in the end, isn't that what endures? Saint Helena, a barren rock in the middle of the Atlantic, 5,000 miles from my Paris. The British chose well. There would be no escape this time, no triumphant return. Here, on this windswept island, the eagle's wings were finely clipped. Longwood House, my prison, was hardly fit for a former emperor. Damp, rat-infested, windswept. The British had ensured my exile would not be comfortable. Sir Hudson Lowe, my jailer, seemed to take particular pleasure in enforcing every petty restriction. They even addressed me as General Bonaparte, denying my imperial title. Such small men, such small minds. But they couldn't take away my greatest weapon, my mind, my memory, my ability to shape how history would remember me. In exile, I began my most important campaign, the battle for posterity. With my faithful companions, Las Cases, Montholon, Bertrand, I worked to create my legend. Each day I dictated my memoirs, carefully crafting the story I wanted the world to remember. What a novel my life has been, I would often say to my companions. Indeed, it was a novel I was now writing with myself as both author and hero. The military memoirs, the commentary on Caesar's wars, the detailed accounts of my campaigns, all were designed to teach future generations the art of war and leadership. But more than military matters, I wanted to explain my vision. The continental system hadn't been mere economic warfare, it was an attempt to unite Europe. The Code Napoleon wasn't just a legal document, it was a social revolution, spreading the principles of equality and merit across a continent. Even my dynasties weren't mere family ambition, they were attempts to create a European system that could ensure lasting peace. My son, the King of Rome, now lived in Vienna as the Duke of Reichstadt. They were raising him to forget his father, to deny his heritage. I would never see him again, but I dedicated much of my writing to him. My son will read these pages, I would say. He must know why his father fell and what he tried to achieve. The battle with cancer began in 1820. The same disease that had killed my father was now consuming me. Yet even in illness, I maintained my dignity. I may have been the terror of the world, I told my doctor, but I die before my time, murdered by the English oligarchy and its hired assassin. I spent my final days preparing my will, ensuring my loyal followers would be cared for and putting the finishing touches on my legend. To France, I left my most precious possession, the memory of what we accomplished together. To my son, I left my weapons and personal items, hoping they would remind him of his heritage. To history, I left my explanation. I closed the gulf of anarchy and brought order out of chaos. I rewarded merit regardless of birth or wealth, wherever I found it. As death approached in May 1821, a great storm battered the island, nature's salute to a falling emperor. My last words, they say, were, France armée tête d'armée Josephine. Perhaps I said these things, perhaps I didn't. Does it matter? The legend was already written. They buried me on Saint Helena, under a plain stone marked simply Bonaparte. But I knew it wouldn't be my final resting place. My ashes, I had written, should rest on the banks of the Seine, among the French people I loved so well. 19 years later, Louis-Philippe would fulfill this wish, bringing my remains back to Paris with full honors. But my true legacy wasn't in monuments or memorials. Look at the Europe that emerged after my fall. The Code Napoleon remained the basis of law in much of Europe. The administrative systems I created continued to function. The idea of careers open to talent, of merit over birth, survived my defeat. Even my enemies had to adopt my innovations to defeat me. Prussia reformed its army and society along French lines. Russia modernized its administration. Britain, while maintaining its traditional institutions, had to become more meritocratic. The nationalist movements that would reshape 19th century Europe owed much to my actions. I had shown that the old order could be overthrown, that nations could be remade. Italy and Germany would unite following paths I had first mapped. Even the United States benefited from my actions. The Louisiana Purchase doubled its size and set it on the path to continental power. Was I a liberator or a tyrant, a modernizer or a despot? Perhaps I was all these things. I was a child of the Revolution who became an emperor, a Republican general who created a new aristocracy, a rationalist who restored the Catholic Church, a conqueror who spread liberal reforms. My nephew, Louis Napoleon, would later revive the empire, styling himself Napoleon III. He understood something vital. Napoleon was more than a man. It was an idea, a symbol of glory and modernization, of authority and reform. The Second Empire would try to recreate this magic, but times had changed. You cannot step into the same river twice. From this lonely rock, I could see my life clearly at last. I had risen higher and fallen further than any man in modern history. I had changed the face of Europe, for good or ill. I had proven that one man's will could reshape the world, though perhaps not always as he intended. To those who would judge me, I say this: look at what I built, not just what I destroyed. The Code Napoleon, the Lycées, the Bank of France, the Legion of Honor, these survive. The principles of meritocracy, of rational administration, of national unity, these transformed Europe. Yes, I was ambitious. Yes, I sought glory. But I also sought to build something new, a Europe united not by conquest but by common laws and principles, a society where talent mattered more than birth, where reason prevailed over tradition. Did I fail? In the short term, perhaps. But ideas, once released into the world, cannot be imprisoned or exiled. They live on, transforming themselves, finding new expressions. My greatest victory was not on any battlefield. It was in the minds of men, in the changes I set in motion that would reshape the world long after I was gone. From this windswept rock facing my final battle with death, I could say this: I had lived as I believed a man should live, boldly, grandly, changing the world through force of will and strength of vision. Future generations would judge me, but they would not forget me. History, they say, is written by the victors, but sometimes the defeated write more compelling stories. From my rocky exile on Saint Helena, I launched my final and perhaps most successful campaign, the Battle for Memory. Let me tell you how history would remember Napoleon Bonaparte and how much of that memory I carefully crafted myself. The British thought they could silence me on Saint Helena. Instead, they gave me the time and isolation needed to create my legend. Every conversation with my companions was a chance to shape the narrative. Las Cases, Montauban, Bertrand, they were not just my companions, but my evangelists, carrying my gospel to future generations. What a novel my life has been, I would often say. Indeed, I became the hero of the century's greatest story, the young officer rising through revolution, the general conquering Italy, the consul rebuilding France, the emperor dominating Europe, every chapter more dramatic than the last. Artists, writers, poets would retell my story countless times, each adding to the legend. The Napoleonic legend, as it would be called, took many forms. To liberals, I was the heir of the revolution, spreading its principles across Europe. To nationalists, I was the inspiration for national unity and pride. To military men, I was the greatest commander in history. To administrators, I was the modernizer who rationalized government. Even my enemies had to acknowledge my achievements. Victor Hugo would write that I was the seedsman God had chosen. Goethe saw me as a titanic figure of world historical importance. Even my British jailers, watching me pace in my garden at Longwood, knew they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Lord Byron would write, "Napoleon, the wonder and the terror of time." The physical legacy was undeniable. The Code Napoleon remained the basis of law across much of Europe and beyond. The educational system I created, the lycées, the grandes écoles, continued to produce France's elite. The Legion of Honor still rewarded merit. The Bank of France still managed the economy. The administrative divisions and systems I established still functioned. But more important was the ideological legacy. I had shown that the old order could be overthrown, that talent could rise to the highest positions, that nations could be remade. The nationalist movements of the 19th century, in Italy, Germany, Poland, all drew inspiration from my example. Even those who hated me had to adopt my innovations to compete. My nephew, Louis Napoleon, understood this power. When he became Napoleon III, he wasn't just claiming a name, he was claiming a legacy of glory and modernization. The Second Empire would try to recreate the magic of the first, combining authoritarian power with progressive reform. It was an echo of my reign, though times had changed. In death, I became larger than life. When my remains were returned to Paris in 1840, millions lined the streets. The magnificent tomb at Les Invalides became a shrine not just to a man, but to an idea: French glory, military genius, the power of will to reshape the world. The military academies studied my campaigns. Clausewitz based his theories of warfare on his analysis of my strategies. Even today, my battles are required reading for officers. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, these names became synonymous with tactical brilliance. But perhaps my greatest victory was in transforming defeat into legend. The retreat from Moscow, Waterloo, even my exile, all became part of the epic tale. Like Prometheus punished by the gods for giving fire to mankind, I was the titan brought low by opposing fate itself. My personal effects became relics: my hat, my sword, my lock of hair. The little things I touched or owned became treasures in museums across the world. My image appeared on everything from fine art to cheap souvenirs. I became not just a historical figure, but a cultural icon. The controversy never ended. Was I a liberator or a tyrant, a modernizer or a despot, an heir of the revolution or its betrayer? Each generation would debate these questions anew, finding in me what they sought, hero or villain, reformer or reactionary, visionary or megalomaniac. The truth, as always, is more complex. I was a child of my time, of revolution, of enlightenment, of romanticism. I was a bridge between the old world and the new, combining traditional authority with modern efficiency, aristocratic style with meritocratic substance. To France, I gave glory and tragedy, modernization and exhaustion, victory and defeat. To Europe, I gave war and reform, destruction and renewal. The borders I drew would be erased, but the administrative systems I created would endure. The armies I led would be defeated, but the principles of warfare I developed would be studied for centuries. My real legacy lies not in what I conquered, but in what I built. The Code Napoleon, spreading legal equality across Europe, the educational system, opening careers to talent, the administrative reforms, creating rational government. These outlasted my empire and shaped the modern world. To those who would follow in my footsteps, remember this: greatness comes at a price. I reached higher than any man of my time, but I also fell further. I changed the world, but died in exile. I won immortal fame, but lost my only son. Was it worth it? History must judge. I am Napoleon, emperor, conqueror, reformer, exile. My story is one of triumph and tragedy, of soaring ambition and crushing defeat, of brilliance and hubris. I reshaped Europe through force of arms, but my most lasting victories were not won on battlefields. In the end, perhaps that is my greatest legacy. Not the battles won or lost, not the empires built and destroyed, but the proof that one man's will and vision can change the world. Whether for good or ill, I showed what was possible. Let history judge me as it will. I am content knowing that my name will be remembered as long as men dream of glory and nations strive for greatness. For, as I said on Saint Helena, impossible is a word only to be found in the dictionary of fools.